This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Diaz and Tim Manici.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And this one, Jay, is a special episode. We've done these a few times before. We brought it back for 2024. That rhymed. I didn't intend it. It's what we call a diamond episode. There's shimmery sounds now. Diamonds. I don't know if diamonds don't shimmer. I mean, I guess they sparkle. Anyway,
they
we
do
previously
it all, man. They sparkle, they shimmer, they shine.
I guess they do everything. We previously talked about No Doubt and their album Tragic Kingdom. We talked about Pearl Jam's 10. And for this episode,
we snuck one in this season too.
Did we? What did we do?
Hootie.
Well, yes, but that was not technically a diamond episode.
I said we snuck it in.
You snuck it in. That's true.
It came in through the side door, but it is a diamond selling album.
When it went through the side door where the dog gets in, and this time we put it up on our we actually did tell everybody we're doing a diamond poll, and it is one that we picked because I've been curious about going back to this record. I don't think I ever listened to it.
Oh, okay.
But I listened to all the singles, of which there were 6 singles on a record of essentially 12 songs. So half the album were singles.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Man. I mean, I think there were 6 singles between Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, but that's a double album.
That's next level diamond. That's like trying to think, like that Cars debut.
Yeah, the Boston debut. Those
Boston debut, where it's like every song of the album was a single almost.
Maybe the Van Halen debut. A lot of debuts, which this one is and isn't, and we'll explain. We're talking about the 1995 album Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette. Not the musical on Broadway, but the actual album. So let me ask you, Jay, do you own this record?
I do.
You do?
Yeah. I got it around when it came out. I was taken by You Ought to Know. It just hit me as something very new and exciting. I liked the edge of it. I had the edginess of it, and I got the. I don't remember if I got it through a record club. At that time, you could also get, big selling albums. You could get pretty good deals at like Best Buy and stuff. This would have been a time they started doing the end caps where you could get whatever the hottest selling records were for like $5. So I mean, we maybe got it that way, but I got it pretty soon after it came out, and I'm very familiar with it. My wife loves it. Sort of been around our life since it came out.
I've never owned the album, and like I said, I really only knew the singles to this record. So I don't really have any history with it. I did like most of the singles. And what's interesting is the one that I liked the best at the time was the last single released, which is All I Really Want. I think because it had like that a little bit edgier sound musically, had that bigger guitar sound on the record, on the song, but you could not escape any of these songs, both on radio and on MTV. The videos were in constant rotation, whether it was You Ought to Know or Hand in Pocket or Ironic. Like the Ironic video has been parodied, I think, probably 100 times. And I don't know if you've watched, there's a documentary on, I think, HBO Max called Jagged that came out during COVID. I think it was like 2021 it came out. That gets into how they actually get to this point of making this record.
Right.
So for you youngins out there, you might not know this, but Alanis Morissette was on a TV show
Yep.
for a period of time in Canada called You Can't Do That on Television, which was, I don't know how to describe it. It was like a sketch show with like comedy bits, and it was just like a
Kind of like a
local
classic.
Canadian
It was kind of like a classic variety show for kids,
yeah, it starred
like
kids
from
who
the
were in high
60s
school.
and 70s.
Mm-hmm. It actually started in Canada in like 1979, and then started airing in the United States in 81. And I remember it being one of the first things you could watch on Nickelodeon.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. And Canadians had Second City, and they've always had like a sketch comedy. A lot of amazing comedians have come out of Canada. So this was, I guess, like the JV version, or the the young version of that. Um,
It kind of mirrors, we were discussing this on the Discord. Hal and I were talking about somebody like Olivia Rodrigo, who,
mm-hmm.
and there's been many other pop stars, right, in modern times that,
Yep.
or since then, that have followed a similar trajectory where but we called her out in particular because she comes from TV. She did a record that was more pop, and then she did a new album that was very edgy.
Mm-hmm.
We were sort of debating the authenticity of it. And I kind of went back to this record and said, well, we never really questioned Alanis's authenticity. Why are we questioning Olivia Rodrigo's? Like,
Right.
it's very similar stories, right? In terms of like, they both found producers that helped them get to this sound. They bring in guest musicians. It's very like angsty, straight from the heart type lyrics. It seems like very paralleled stories. So she definitely um, started a trend that way.
And she also, like you said, made records, but her first album, which was just under her first name, Alanis, was self-titled, released in Canada only in April of 1990. And it's a straight, like, produced pop record. Like, it's not anything like Jagged Little Pill. And then the following year, the follow-up came out called Now Is the Time. Again, only released in Canada on MCA Records in Canada. It was produced with Leslie Howe, who also produced the first record. And from watching the documentary and reading about her, she was sort of over it at that point. She had kind of had, I think she had not the best experience in the studio, being basically told what to sing and not really having any input on a lot of stuff. And she would, you know, write some songs, try to include some thoughtful lyrics or whatever. And she was getting compared to like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson, which is right around that time.
Yep.
And it didn't do, the second record, I guess, did not do as well as the first. And her deal was up with MCA Canada. So she was just without a deal. She's only 19 at this point. Like, and her career is over, essentially.
Wild. Yep.
I mean,
Pop music is brutal.
It is absolutely brutal. She still had a publishing deal with MCA. So, and she had a manager, and says, you've got a really good voice. She's still living at home with her parents, which is, again, she's been a TV star, she's been a
Yeah.
pop star, and she's still living at home with her parents. So she moves from Ottawa to Toronto at this point, from the small city of Ottawa to the big city of Toronto, which is sort of like moving from like Albany, New York to New York City, essentially in the United States. And this is where she meets Glen Ballard, who I believe is also a Canadian. If I'm not, or no, maybe he might be American, but maybe somehow they met while she was there. And they start talking about, well, what do you want to do, and what songwriting and stuff like that. Because the manager was like, I think you would work well with Glen, who's a songwriter, just pure songwriter. So they start. I guess they do it in LA, where Glen is based, and they go to his house, which could, again, we're talking about a 19-year-old. This could get real creepy, but luckily it doesn't.
Right.
Um, and he's
Yeah, the
like,
story doesn't always turn out well.
yes, exactly. And he's like, let's just see what happens. So they
Yeah.
just get like an acoustic guitar, a little drum machine, and start working on stuff. And within like an hour, they have a completed song. And he's like, holy crap, like we have something here. We're on the same wavelength, which, like when you're working with someone musically, you either like click or you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So within like a couple days, like the third song I think they wrote was Ironic, which again, like that's just kismet. Like you are
Yeah.
finding someone who gets you at that point. So they spend time together, put together some demos, start sending them out to record labels, and nobody's interested. Shop them to everybody in LA. It just so happened that Madonna was starting a record label called Maverick, and Guy
Uh,
Oseary was the guy who was her, really the guy who was running the labels. I mean, Madonna's Madonna. She's not going to sit in an office all day running a record label.
Listening to demo tapes.
She's not popping tapes in a cassette player and going, this one, yeah.
Right.
So Guy Oseary, I guess, like hears it and goes, okay, I like what I'm hearing. They keep doing demos, and then they finally decide to get into the studio. Some of the songs get redone. Like for example, You Ought to Know, which was done with a couple of more studio based guys. When they took it to do it in actual studio, they got hooked up with Flea and Dave Navarro, and Dave Navarro was at that time the guitar player in the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and they
Yeah.
gave them just the vocal, no guide track, no drums, no click, nothing. They said, here's the vocal for this song, do whatever you want with it.
Wow.
And so they wrote, they just spent time jamming. Obviously they're in a band together, they know how to jam. I'm sure Flea is great at jamming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
The drummer on that is Matt Logg, who's now in AC/DC, by
yep,
the way.
which is an crazy trajectory.
Yeah.
um and that's kind of how the record went. Like Glen Ballard plays a lot on the album. Mostly he's doing the programming for the drums, he's playing some keyboards, he's doing some guitar. Dave Navarro plays guitar and You Ought to Know. um uh Flea plays bass on You Ought to Know. Benmont Tench from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, he plays
Crazy.
organ on like half the album.
Love him.
Yes, absolutely fantastic contributor. Always plays
The right part.
the exact way, just like Mike Campbell always plays
Yeah.
exactly the right part.
Yeah.
They get, there's a lot of people just kind of contributing parts here and there. Not everybody are known people that were around at that time. So like Joel Shearer, who is currently in a band called Pedestrian, but he's played with as a backing artist for Gnarls Barkley, Damian Rice, Death Cab for Cutie, Our Lady Peace, Dido. One of they got like those guys that are always hanging around studios and on call.
Yep.
So they make the record. MC or Maverick is just like, hopefully we can sell like 500,000 copies and we can make enough for you to make a second record.
Right.
That was their goal. Let's just break this obscure Canadian artist in the United States, and maybe we'll get a little bit of enough enough attention that we can make another record. But then K Rock heard it in LA and started playing You Ought to Know, and it just immediately blew up. Like, and we're going to mention it in the comments for this poll. One of the there was a DJ, Keith Badge mentioned this. There's a DJ going, you don't have to request the song, we're going to play it at 4:00, like we will play the song. Everybody's calling, and that was what it was like you could hear this in heavy rotation. And then it had a video to go with it. It was extremely it felt like it went from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time. That's right. I remember seeing the video, just being like, "What is this?" And
Yeah.
probably like you, like I was like, "This doesn't sound like anything that
Yep.
I've heard before." Both
I
in
heard it
terms
on
of
the
her voice.
radio first.
Yep.
Yeah, it took off like a rocket.
So you had that. That was the first single release. That was July of 1995. By September, they release "You Learn." October, "Hand in My Pocket." Those are first three singles over 4 months. Okay, now you're going to understand why this is sold 33 million copies as an album. 33 million. That's an insane
Wow.
number. Then to kick off 1996 in February, you get "Ironic" with that video, "Head Over Feet" in July, and then November of 96, the final official single, "All I Really Want." And that's half the record, because "You Ought to Know" is on there twice. It's the second track. And then there's track 13, which is known as the Jimmy the Saint blend, which is the actual track that was used for the music video. The music video has a slightly different mix, I guess, for TV. I don't know. I don't understand that process. That happened a couple times in the 90s. Like the Even Flow video is not the same audio as the Even Flow that's on the album for Pearl Jam.
Oh.
And then there's an acapella song that ends the record called "Your House," which is like the hidden track, because every album in the 90s had a hidden track. Neither of those are on the vinyl version. And if you have the vinyl version of this released in 1995, I'm guessing it's worth a few pennies, because not a lot of vinyl was pressed in 1995. So Alanis is credited with every lyric on the album, and then the music is credited to Alanis and Glen Ballard. So in case you're wondering whether or not he had any input on the lyrics, he did not. He might have said, "That's a good lyric, keep that one," but she said they usually did the lyrics in one or two takes, in terms of like, she would go right into the booth, they do a take. If she liked it, they kept it. If not, she would change something and they do a second take, and that was it. It was real fast.
Yeah.
Which, again, like, I'm thinking of other albums that sell in the diamond status, and like, those are not necessarily one or two take records. Like,
No.
those are worked on over and over again. Like, even the Hootie record that we talked about, they played that album for years before they got into the studio and refined it and worked it out. So this is quite a unusual situation. The legacy of this, of course, is that she won for the Juno Awards in Canada. She won Album of the Year, Single of the Year, Female Vocalist of the Year, Songwriter of the Year, and Best Rock Album. So she basically swept the Juno Awards up in Canada. At the Grammys, she won Best Female Rock Vocal Performance, Best Rock Song for You Ought to Know, Best Rock Album, and Album of the Year. She's tied with Carole King and Bonnie Raitt for the most Grammys won at a single ceremony at that time. I'm assuming Taylor Swift has surpassed that.
Yeah.
Or Beyonce, as far as the Grammys go. And then Glen Ballard was nominated as Producer of the Year for non-classical. Ironic then in the following year, because it was released the next year, was Record of the Year in Best Music Video Short Form. I don't know exactly what that means. Of course, this is like on tons of top 100 albums, top 1,000 albums, 500 greatest albums, 1,001 albums you have to hear before you die, 90s records, all that kind of stuff. It's been adapted, as I mentioned, to the stage. It opened a limited run of performances in May of 2018. And there's a whole jukebox musical thing that's happened in the last, I don't know, like 20 years, I guess, where albums and musical artists get their whole catalog turned into a I'm actually surprised that we haven't had the docudrama version of this album, like we have with like The Dirt by Motley Crue and those kind of things. Like, where's the Jagged Little Pill Netflix movie? I want to see that, because who do you get to play Alanis? You could do it. You could have Olivia Rodrigo play play Alanis or Alanis. I don't know which one is correct. Um, in a sort of meta commentary on what you were talking
Are you
about.
meaning like do the whole Dave, what's his name? Kuye
Yep.
backstory and up
Yep.
to her moving in with Glen Ballard and
Mm-hmm.
like that whole, okay.
Like you have like an
I like
instrumental
this, but I like
version.
this album better when I don't think about that backstory.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well,
Like
and
knowing who the song's about for me kind of kills it
she's
for any
never
artist. But
confirmed that.
I know, but like believing that
Right.
doesn't help me appreciate the album more.
So again, I gotta like just put this in perspective. She's 21 when this came out. Imagine what an idiot you and I were at 21. We're still in college.
Yeah. Crazy.
And she's already on her third record after being on a TV show, and this album blows up. I don't know how you keep your head after that. Obviously, this was influential. People from Taylor Swift to Avril Lavigne to Katy Perry, Kelly Clarkson, um, basically any female artist of like the last 25 years has cited this as a record that influenced them.
Yeah.
Which again totally makes sense, and also opened the doors for a lot of people. In we get a Tracy Bonham, we get a Meredith Brooks, we get a Fiona Apple because of Alanis being so successful.
Like female artists getting signed after this,
and they don't have to be pop, they don't have to be R&B, they can just, it was so few and far between where you would get an alternative rock. You had your Liz Phair, but again, that was more, that was indie. And
no, that wasn't mainstream at all.
Right. It did make me think when I was listening to this record, I'm like, what if this was Liz Phair's follow-up to Exile in Guyville? Like, it's in the same ballpark about like very naked and forthright songwriting lyrics, like not holding anything back. The production's in some ways is not that far off from Exile on Guyville in that there's a lot of like drum machines and it's not all hi-fi in some ways. I'll get into that more later because I have some thoughts about that. Yeah. But some comments we got over at Patreon. I expected this to be divisive, and I was correct. Kyle Bittner said, for its time, this is a bona fide classic and a breath of air amongst the testosterone-driven rock music. It was great to hear a strong female presence, not afraid to speak her mind. Even though I may not listen to it much now, there are still a few songs that I thoroughly enjoy, with You Learn and Head Over Feet standing tall were the album. On the flip side, Jeremy Mann said, after the Hootie debacle, I'm going to be nice and say that I would listen to this album again before I listen to anything from Darius Rucker. Decent single. As a novelty, I appreciate it. Okay. I don't know what novelty means, but Willie Dillon said, I know Alanis is kind of love or hate artist, but honestly, this album is pure 90s ear candy for me. Scott Hallgrim, single, You Ought to Know, B-side with You Learn. Keith Preston, the lyrics are pretty ridiculous for the most part. This album is still engaging, and in my opinion, it's easily her best album. Rudy Stull said, little known fact, working title was Exile in Frog Stomp. I don't know why that's funny, but that's funny to me. Ian McIver said, when I first heard You Ought to Know with the infamous lyric about the theater back in 1995, the first two thoughts in my head were, I'm dating the wrong type of girls, and this is going to really break open the alternative scene for female singers. When it first never came true, there is no denying the second and the impact of Alanis Morissette and this album had on music almost 30 years ago. However, due to CanCon rules, I was first subjected to Alanis back in 1990 with the way too poppy single Too Hot, thanks to my sister. She had yet to use her surname. I guess adding it signified a change. A little bit of trivia soon spread around school, I guess in a failed attempt to stop the juggernaut of an album this would become. I guess in Canada, yeah, if you knew this was a pop artist, you'd be like, oh, you might deride this a little bit. One can make a better.
Might be more like the Olivia Rodrigo thing I was talking about. Like, oh, yes. I remember, and now you've changed. So wait, this is weird.
Right, exactly. One Can Make a Better EP with just the singles. There were 6 then, but outside of those songs, I wasn't familiar with the album tracks. After listening to them, it does not change my previous opinions of Alanis or the album. It's no secret that I march to the beat of my own electronic drum. For such an iconic and monumental album, I give the rating of a decent single solely for the humor of Ironic and the countless parody videos that followed. And you ought to know for the guest musician, isn't it ironic? Don't you think? And then Keith Badge said, I remember turning on the radio, and this is where he said about the DJ telling people to stop. It was really a breath of fresh air at the time. I'm undecided whether or not it holds up or this is a good full record. Listening now. And then he followed that up with, we're the album. It was overplayed and overhyped. It's often cheesy and cringy, but the only truly bad song is Right Through You. It's a mess, but it's too weirdly charming for me to hate. Interesting responses. We'll get more into the comments. And I have some comments from some professional music writers at the time that I want to highlight because I feel like they can help lend a little bit of more clarity to all that. But Jay, you were familiar with this record, so going back to it now, tell me what works for you on Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette.
Well, like I said at the time, it didn't sound like anything else, so it jumped out to me the minute I heard it on radio. Revisiting it, even though it's inspired so many other artists, it still doesn't sound like anybody else. I think that comes down to a couple things. One is you can just hear the spontaneity, I think, in the production of the record. It just feels inspired in the moment. You can tell they're kind of piecing together the sounds and, the lyrics and even some of the vocal performances just all sound of the moment, not overthought, very like emotion driven. You can capture it. It just captures that sense of like, oh, this is like high energy, spontaneous creativity. And that comes through even now. Couple things just in terms of like musically, I think what's going on there that makes it sound unique is there's some interesting guitar parts and layers throughout this record that really help complement her voice. They don't ever get in the way. They're always like clever in the way that they kind of back out, play on the offbeat, are always in service of whatever it is she's singing and let her voice be up front. But they're interesting when you listen to them by themselves. So it kind of hits that sweet spot of like not just strumming along chords. I mean, some of these guitar parts, if you just listen to them by themselves, they almost wouldn't make any sense without the vocal. But they're melodic and interesting. And then they just mix them together with unusual tones, the direct amps, it's kind of a dry record, so there'd be a lot of direct distortions that were guitars mixed with acoustics, mixed with harmonica, which I've forgotten was on this record, but there's a couple songs on here where that pops. All I Really Want, Hand in My Pocket, Head Over Feet. And the way the harmonica kind of blends with those guitar tones is interesting. Like sometimes you can't even separate the two. The mix of drum machines and real drums is another unique thing going on here. It's one of the better examples I can think of where they use both really effectively. Often they're using these drum machines to kind of set up, subtle grooves that she can then sing over that maybe would be the quiet part in a typical rock song. And then they let the drum performances drop in or come in to really inject the track with some energy. I think they're just really effective in how they're doing that. And then, they let the musicians play. When you listen to You Want to Know, I mean, Flea's kind of going crazy on that song. Like, that is like a lot of bass runs and notes and stuff that typically, on an album that's trying to have some of the pop appeal, you would edit all that out, right? You would tell the bass player, okay, tone down. And they just let them play. And I think that's one of the things, and you hear it not just in that song, but in a lot of the other songs too. Right Through You is another example.
Wait a minute, sir. You kind of hurt my feelings. see me as a sweet back-loaded puppet, and you got a meal ticket taste. She like you, I know right through you. I feel right through you. I walk right through
You can just hear the bass player just free and just doing the part that he thinks is gonna, work and not being overproduced and overthought, and it just adds to that mix of overall tone of it, not being spontaneous and not overly watered down. And I guess the last thing, just to touch on all of that I just talked about, it is in service of her voice, and her songwriting, which is really, it was unique at the time and it's still unique. Like I don't know many other people that sound like her. She's very rhythmically oriented, which I think feels to me. I like singers that know how to use rhythm, and she has a ton of range there. She can almost like, there's some stuff on here that's almost spoken word. There's stuff that's very wordy. There's stuff that isn't. The melodies are unique. There's a ton of range, on here. She can be very expressive. It's almost like every emotion you can imagine is communicated vocally on this album from start to finish. And I guess the last part is just the production on the voice. You can also tell, like, Glen Ballard knew what he had. Is very dry. There's almost, I don't hear it. I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of reverb, but there's very little reverb on this. I don't hear any delay. There's no doubling. Some choruses will have a harmony part, but is just her voice dry up front performing. Like, and I think that's just really smart, right? Just like, like, hey, this is what this person brings to the table, right? Interesting songwriter, incredibly diverse voice. Let's just put her in the middle and then build this sound around her that just complements that and doesn't get in the way or complicates it or muddies it. So that's what works for me. It's a really unique sounding album.
It is with great urgency that we bring you these following messages.
The 1990s. My very favorite decade, especially for music. This is Dope Nostalgia, and I'm your host, Naomi Carmack. And every week, we revisit the era that brought us Hammer Pants, Crystal Pepsi, Pogs, Hypercolor, Pokemon, and some of the greatest songs of all time. On Dope Nostalgia, not only do I have episodes where I talk about the big artists of the 90s with friends, but sometimes those big artists come on the show. Past guests include Naughty by Nature, George Lamond, Alana Miles, Color Me Bad, Biff Naked, Ed the Sock, Shakespeare's Sister, Two Unlimited, The Funky Bunch, Technotronic, Rosala, Tara Kemp, Mr. Big, Honeymoon Suite, Right Said Fred, and so many more. You can always leave us a voicemail and tell us what you think, and we'll play it on the show. 780-851-8785. Dope Nostalgia, a podcast made for 90s kids like me. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Music, Podbean, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are served.
What works for you?
Well, having been the first time I actually listened to the whole record and get to hear the entire project, I guess I would say, because it was, this thing that they worked on together. It really gives you a great idea of someone just completely ditching everything that worked for them before being a manufactured pop artist and just letting loose lyrically, vocally, just not giving a shit in terms of, I am going to say exactly what is on my mind, whether it's stream of consciousness or just, putting down specific things that are meant to dig at people. And what you said about the drum machines giving her a groove, I feel like that was really smart on Glen Ballard's part, because she came from dance music essentially and pop music, which again is all groove oriented. And when he took advantage of her ability to work with that sort of material, but just recontextualized it with a much more stripped down, focused approach. And like you said, there's almost no reverb on this at all. It's just dry, because her voice is, and her lyrics are the whole point of all this. All this falls apart without her being a uniquely singular songwriter. And listening now, not being annoyed by the fact that I've heard this 500 times on the radio, and actually being able to listen to what she's saying with fresh ears, it's really remarkable to get as much material as she did for just one record. Like, to me, a lot of these songs, this would be spread out over like 3 or 4 albums of material. It's so condensed, and again, I'm just floored by the fact she was 21 at the time when she did this, because I'm a fan. I'm a fan of the Tragically Hip, which is now obvious. I've talked about it a million times over the years. A lot of it has to do with the lyrical content, and because Gord Downie is able to take very simple ideas and create very artistic ways of saying them, but he doesn't always have, like, his voice is what sometimes turns people off. He just has a voice that doesn't quite connect with people. I feel like maybe there's a lot of Canadians like Rain Media has a very distinct voice, and if you don't like his voice, that's not going to work for you.
Yeah.
And I feel like this fits in with that world of, there's like so much interesting things that she's saying, but I can understand where if the voice doesn't work for you, and it's really right out of the gate, like you turn on All I Really Want, and it starts out, and she does that I like that part. I'm like, I can understand people going, oh, what's this yodeling that's happening here?
Do I stress you out? My sweater's on backwards and inside out, and you say how appropriate. I don't want to dissect everything today. I don't mean to pick you apart, you see, but I can't help it. And there I go, jumping before the gunshot has gone off. Slap me with the splintered ruler, and it would knock me to the floor, but I wasn't there already. If only I could hunt the hunter. And all I really want is some patience, a way to calm the angry voice.
Now I just hear like someone completely free of any constraints, and I'm going to do exactly what I want to do. The thing you mentioned about the music that's backing her up, I never really paid attention to any of that when it first came out, and I didn't know that Flea was playing, and I wasn't a huge Red Hot Chili Peppers fan. I liked Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I think I bought One Hot Minute when it came out, but I don't really remember listening to it that much. But now listening to it, I'm like, my God, Flea is just going nuts on this track.
Right.
Like, there's so many, it's just nonstop. I mean, and it's great because it provides, you have, everything is basically 4/4. Like, there's no weird time signatures or anything like that. So unless you're just going to stick to that simple drum part, you need someone like Flea to come in and do something wild like that. And I think that's why the harmonica works, because the harmonica is so uneven. It doesn't stick to bars. It doesn't stick to, this is where the one is. It just kind of flows throughout. And that's her. I think that's the only instrument she played on the record, which kind of reminded me of Neil Young. Neil Young plays harmonica, and you're just like, does he really know how to play, or is he just having fun?
Right. But it adds the spontaneity, right? I mean, both of
Yes.
those things. Like, you also mentioning how she's singing on the album, she's just letting it go. It's like, and the same thing they did with the Players. The Ought to Know story you shared earlier was a perfect example of, like, you've got 3 incredible musicians. Just book the studio for the afternoon and get out of the way. Like that. This is your production job. Find the right musicians for that track. Get them the time to record. Give them a good engineer and leave.
Yep.
And more than likely, when you pick the tape up at the end of the day, you're going to have something good.
Exactly. Sometimes you just got to let things happen and
Yeah.
and get out of the way. In one of the things that concerned me, not because I guess I was looking back at some of the reviews at the time because I wanted to know, like, was this actually appreciated, or was this, a sort of middle of the road in terms of reviews? And it did have a lot of positive reviews. I did find it interesting in that when there were negative reviews, some of the choices of how they criticized it came across as inherent, like a bit sexist. So I like
Sure.
Greg Kot from the Chicago Tribune. I think he's a really good writer. I've listened to Sound Opinions for years. There's a quote on Wikipedia that says, strives for catharsis, but often merely sounds histrionic. If you know the history of the word histrionic, it comes from hysteria.
Yep.
And that is how doctors would describe women who were like acting up. Oh, she's
Yeah.
hysterical.
Right.
She has hysteria. And they created a personality disorder for women
You
when
could
it
say
was really just anger.
yeah, or just women pushing against the normal like pressures of living in a patriarchal
Exactly.
society. It's like, well, you must be hysterical.
Oh, she's a hysterical woman. She's lost her mind. And it
She's
was
not
kind of,
accepting
it was
her subjugation.
yeah, it was disappointing to read that sort of
Yeah.
verbiage,
Mm-hmm.
because it just plays on old tropes about, if a woman is expressing herself with anger or frustration, she clearly is not mentally well.
Yeah.
And that made me a little bit,
But if
not
men did
upset, but
it,
just like it was disappointing.
but if men
Um,
were, I mean, men were doing it at the time and it was expected. It was punk.
right. Well, I don't want to get into a debate about what emo is, but
Yeah. Yeah. Or
expressing
emo,
your
yeah.
emotions was perfectly fine for
Yeah.
a lot of bands in a lot of different genres. But as soon as a woman comes along and it's a negative, like I was thinking about this in comparison to, I don't know if you remember this song, Sophie B. Hawkins, Damn, I Wish I Was Your Lover,
Mhm.
which has a similar feel to this. It has a drum beat,
Yep.
but it's a sexy song singing
Mhm.
about, oh, I wish I could get with you, which
Mhm.
is totally fine. I love that song. I think it's great.
Mhm.
This is not that album. This is the
No.
flip side of that. This is F you screwed me over, and now I'm pissed. I'm going to talk about it. That's to me the yin and the yang, or of the experience, like you positive and negative. But when it's negative, all of a sudden it becomes there's something inherently wrong with this person, and
Mhm.
that makes it less valuable, I guess. And I actually even read, like, there was a writer for, I think, Slate or um one of those online, and it was a woman who I normally like, Amanda Marcotte, who writes a lot of interesting political and social commentary, was like, this is not an album you should regale. Like, it's not a feminist, especially that song You Ought to Know. She's like, if this was written by a guy, he would be complaining about putting in the friend zone. And I disagree with that. I'm like, this is someone who got betrayed. We're not talking about like someone who won't be your friend anymore, or won't date you, just wants to be friends. Like, that's a song about someone who was with you and now is completely cut you out of their life with no explanation. That's, to me, is different. So I disagree with that, because it was in the context of, oh, look at Taylor Swift brought out Alanis to sing this song with her when she was out in LA, or other artists like Beyonce covered this. I had no idea that Beyonce was doing this song as part of one of her tours and
Hmm.
covering You Ought to Know, which is, again, crazy. I'm like, Beyonce has a huge catalog,
Yeah.
and to think that she's like doing an Alanis Morissette song from 1995 as a part of it. But again,
Mhm.
the impact that it has makes total sense, as far
Well, just
as
the idea of a critic saying we shouldn't do something. It's like,
Mhm.
I don't know. I just don't like this whole we thing and they thing. It's
Right.
like she's obviously validating people's experiences and emotions. And if they're connecting with that, who are you to tell them they can't, they just shouldn't? you can say like, I don't connect with that.
Yep.
Here's why I don't connect with that. But to tell other people they shouldn't, no, I just don't like, I don't understand that logic, or I'm sure it gets clicks and people upset, but in terms of actual critique that's valuable, I don't understand that.
Okay, so now speaking of critiques, let's get into some stuff that doesn't work about this record. Is there anything that doesn't work for you on it?
You know, I'm pretty tired of some of the singles. So honestly, reviewing the record, I listened to them once and then on repeated listens, I was skipping. Those being mostly Hand in My Pocket and Ironic. Those were the two that maybe grated on me the most of being overplayed, and maybe the parodies of at least Ironic have sort of stained that song for me a bit. At the time, I thought it was super clever. But it doesn't hold up quite as well for me anymore, probably just more from the cultural impact it made. You know, some of it is very a little too 90s sounding. I wish it was just had a slightly more, particularly the second half of the album, it gets very drum machine heavy. I don't know if that's just a accident of the sequencing, but in analyzing it, it started to make me like project, oh, maybe it almost sounds like they ran on a budget for the second half of the album. You know, you hear less musicianship, you just hear more like 90s drum machines, head over feet, Ironic, Not the Doctor, Wake Up, have some very signature like mid 90s sounding stuff going on production wise, that I think the first half of the record, when they mix in the performances and the live drums, and it doesn't bother me as much. You get more variety.
I don't wanna be the filler if the void is solely yours. I don't wanna be your glass of single malt whiskey hidden in the bottom drawer. And I don't wanna be a bandage if the wound is not mine. Lend me some fresh air. I don't wanna be adored for what I merely represent to you. I don't wanna be a babysitter, you're a very big boy now. I don't wanna be a mother, I didn't carry you in my womb for 9 months. Show me the back door. Visiting hours are 9 to 5, and if I show up at 6:10, well, I already know that you'll find some way to sneak me in that door.
I'd love another song on this album that has the intensity of You Ought to Know. Selfishly, like, you know, you can almost see on this record there's almost pairings of songs that kind of go together in terms of their sound or tone or whatever, and that's one that I wish had a, maybe in the second half of the album, had a pair to it that brought that same kind of energy. And obviously I think this has come up, her singing style can be over the top at times. You know, a lot of the yodeling and stuff that we talked about is makes sense in the context of her being, you know, almost a machine in the pop industry, and then be able to do whatever she wants and sing however she wants and just letting herself go. And at the time it felt very like, it was interesting, but it didn't seem like weird at the time. Now when I listen to it, I'm like, wow, this is so over the top. That combined with some of the lyrics, this, for me personally, at 50, you know, are a little hard to connect with. That maybe even, you know, when I was younger, I could at least understand what's going on around me, you know, people in relationships and stuff for myself. So it's more of a cultural stuff, and then some of the just things that work, there's just a touch almost too much that I could just use 5 or 10% less of. Anything that worked for you?
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like the singles that you mentioned were the ones that I was like, I'm not gonna play this over and over again.
Yeah.
I got greater appreciation for like You Learn and Head Over Feet, which were songs I did not necessarily love. And I also appreciated some of the album, like Mary Jane is an interesting album track in that it really shows off what a good voice she has.
Yeah,
she's
that's a great
really able to
performance.
belt it out on that
Yeah.
song.
That one
I
sounds more it has a different tone to it too. That sounds more produced. Sounds a little bit more, I don't know. It's an interesting song. Her voice in a vocal performance on that is definitely a standout. I'm with you. Like it shines in terms of wow, she's an amazing singer. There's something about the production. It's not quite as spontaneous sounding as maybe what I'm looking for. It's more on the atmospheric side and kind of
Yeah,
almost adult contemporary-ish.
it has
Um,
almost a not necessarily the vocal because it's not the same, but it could have been a Sarah McLachlan style song,
yes,
especially when it
yes.
has that like that floating kind of like backing vocal, just sort of ethereal happening in the background. It reminded me of something that could have been on Surfacing or Fumbling Towards Ecstasy.
Mary Jane, what's the point of trying to dream anymore? I hear you're losing weight again, Mary Jane. Do you ever wonder who you're losing it for? Well, it's full speed, baby, in the wrong direction. There's a few bruises, if that's the way you insist on.
I agree with you. I think the drum machine stuff is very 90s. I don't know who discovered the pattern of like boom boom ba-doom, ba-doom, boom, boom, ba-doom, ba-doom, but that seems
Yeah.
like everybody used that drum
Yeah.
pattern. And maybe it was released on a certain keyboard in the 90s, like Korg put out a keyboard and that was one of the presets. Because it seems like that's on a lot of records in the 90s. That little, I don't know what that little like but yeah, I like not the Doctor. I think that like the way that the verses and the choruses build are nice. I like parts of Wake Up. Again, it just sounds like we're just gonna use the beats. We're just gonna
Yeah.
and you needed another You Ought to Know, just in terms of, it doesn't have to be the same exact song, but just some energy.
Yep.
And there were like, I believe there are 10 outtakes from this album. The first song that they wrote together was called The Bottom Line, and that's the first song on the like expanded edition. And then there are like 9 other songs, and none of which have anything to do with, they're not like I don't think they're, early versions of songs. I think they're just songs that didn't make it. So I wonder if, as they were going, if maybe like a song like you said, Mary Jane, doesn't sound like the rest of the record. So I'm wondering if that was in a different part of the process. I can understand like a song with a drum machine being one of the upfront songs, because you're just like hit the drum machine button and let's just see what happens. Whereas if you're going to do something more produced, it's going to take a little bit longer, and that might have been more of a studio as opposed to a home recording. I'm not entirely sure, which is again why we need the docudrama to flesh this all out. Yeah, I mean, her voice it's an acquired taste. If you don't like it, you're not going to like it, and even if you do like it, you might want to have it in doses as opposed to listening to the whole thing all the way through. But I guess it's because I like the Canadians that I don't have a huge issue with it the way that I do with like, I can't stand like Dave Matthews' voice. I'm sure he's a nice guy. I just can't stand his voice. And I know people feel the same way about her or Gord Downey or Neil Young. My wife can't listen to Neil Young. She just does not like his voice. So
yeah, but I feel like maybe because I grew up listening to a lot of metal, like I'm all in for expressive singers. So
sure,
I have a pretty high threshold in terms of people who like or listen to a lot of David Lee Roth. People who throw in a lot of extra stuff, because to me that's all part of the instrument. But I can
Mm-hmm.
see how, some folks might like a more refined singer who only sings the melody and that's it. Doesn't add anything.
You want to take a guess how many countries this went to number one in?
10.
14.
Oh, I was
Four,
gonna say 12. I would have been closer.
14 different charts around the world. It went to number one. It went like in Ireland. It went to number one. In in Denmark. In Belgium. It's big in Belgium.
Yeah.
Portugal.
I guess I wouldn't have guessed that. I don't know. There's something about it's so specific in terms of the lyrical content and even the singing style that feels so North American.
And again, I
I don't
think
know.
this tapped into something that was there in the underground. Like I
Yeah.
mentioned, Liz Phair. Liz Phair did cover some of this territory. Fucking
Yeah.
Run is not that far off from what we're talking about here, but the production is lo-fi. It's not a big record in terms of it's an appreciated record by people who know about music, but it has no like global currency. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
because this had the music videos, because she has the production behind her, she had Madonna behind her, which helps with the Maverick money for promotion, and it just blew up in the United States. And in a lot of ways, at this time, the United States is a driver for pop culture around the world, that this just becomes enormous. I'd be curious to know what the tours were like, because I know she had Taylor Hawkins on drums, and
Was Chaney on bass?
Chaney was on bass. Like
Mm-hmm.
it had to be Beatlesque, I'm guessing. If you're going to number one in 14 countries and you're able to play around the world, you're selling, like I said, I should say 33 million is the total for the world, not just the United States. The United States, it's 17 million. 33 million around the world is pretty good. We're not going to take anything away.
Well, basically half of those were in the United States.
Yes.
That's wild.
Yes.
They cover the tour a little bit in the movie, right? Because she gets into like how the band was kind of being a typical rock band, a bunch of young guys on the road, and
right.
that was causing some issues. And
they were having fun.
There was a little bit of a portion of that movie talking about the tour. It looked pretty wild.
That's right. I remember that part now that you mentioned it. Which, again, I mean, if you're 21, 22, a female out on the road with a bunch of dudes, that's got to be weird, especially if you don't know them. Like, it's not like
Yeah.
No Doubt, where this is a band. They've been together for years. They all know each other. They're friends. They might have even dated in the band. This is not the same thing. So you're kind of going out with strangers and relying on them to be your guys. So I imagine that's weird.
I remember seeing the band live on TV pretty soon after this.
Mm-hmm.
The album came out. That just added more credibility to me too, because you could tell that they were real. They were translating the songs as a real band. They acted, you know what I mean? It felt authentic, and it had that same spontaneous energy that the record had without sounding exactly like the record.
Do you know? So they had the first tour, which was called the Jagged Little Tour. It was 95. Then they had the Intellectual Intercourse Tour from 95 to 96. Then they had the Can't Not Tour, which was in fall of 96. The opening band was Radiohead.
Wow.
In 96. We're not talking about 93 and Pablo Honey. We're talking about Ben's era. That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
When she went out for the album after this, Former Infatuation Junkie, her openers were Garbage and Liz Phair. And at one point, I want to say when she was touring for Jagged Little Pill, when she did when they did Europe, she I think she opened for the Manic Street Preachers, which again, in terms of bands that like appeal to certain people and don't appeal to certain people, like
sure.
I actually would imagine that Nikki Wire was probably a fan of I'm just guessing based on her lyrical content, and Nikki likes to be open in his lyrics. So if anybody's curious of what I'm talking about, just go read the lyrics to Patrick Bateman and you'll understand what I mean by he likes to push the lyrics in the more aggressive direction. So let's talk about overall rating for this Diamond episode. Jay, is it a worthy album, a better EP, or a decent single? Where do you land?
It's a worthy album. I think the story is incredible. They captured a very unique sound and inspired a ton of artists. You know, it was important at the time. I think it's now inspired a musical. Like, it's a phenomenon in terms of its impact over time. You know, and I think it holds up. It holds up better than I hadn't heard. I mean, the singles come up in my wife's playlist every now and then, but hadn't really listened to some of the album tracks in a long time. And I thought, you know, most of the album tracks held up too, other than some of the production nitpicks here and there. But yeah, it's a worthy album for me. How about you?
I was going into this thinking that I might not make it a worthy album, that it was going to be more of an EP for me. But I do agree with you. I think it is a worthy album. I think the songs that like Hand in My Pocket and Ironic that I just I'm a little worn down even now hearing them are ones that I don't need to go back to. But like I mentioned, I think there is something very special about this record and what she was able to get across. And it's not surprising that you know, obviously this sold an insane amount. It's really hard to follow it up. And her being able to get everything out on what is essentially her first real record, and not a record she makes with a producer who is sort of running the show, but one who is being a collaborator. It's not surprising to me that like her next albums have some good songs, but there's never a peak like this. Like Thank You is a good song. Uninvited is a good song. Like there are some good songs on the next couple of records, but this has such a unique perspective that was really not ever heard before in a mainstream album, that I just think it's worthy of attention, and people should check it out. I think it absolutely belongs in the best or the most important records of the decade in terms of defining what the 90s were. Because this is almost a genre in and of itself. The way that it influenced so many artists afterwards. So
for sure. It's kind of surprising looking at her catalog. I mean, Thank You, Uninvited was written, I think, for this album and released like between the first and second, or I'm sorry, not first, but Jagged Little Pill and the next record.
Yeah.
Thank You's on the next record. And that's pretty much it. Like if you look at her top 10 or top 20 most played songs, they're all from Jagged Little Pill.
Mm-hmm.
But she's been very active. I mean, she puts out a record every, I don't know, 5 years or so. I'm sure she's very happy. She made a ton of money from this record and she does what she wants to do. But there's also part of me that's like, I wonder why she couldn't have, or this didn't like perpetuate more, you know, hit songs and bigger records or big records.
In some ways it might have been, it's a double-edged sword, right? It's really cathartic to let this all out.
Yeah.
But then you can also, because of the criticism, you might pull back and go, that might have been a little too much. Like I may have put too much out there for people. And now that like that's what Rivers Cuomo felt after Pinkerton. Like he was so confessional on that record. He never did that again.
Yeah.
And the band has,
She,
arguably suffered because of it.
well, I mean, it's making me think like she's maybe not been able to reinvent herself. She's kind of pigeonholed into like the image of this record, which
Mm-hmm.
to maintain a career, unless you're AC/DC,
Yeah.
you have to reinvent yourself over and over again. Some rock bands don't have to do that, but she's living in a different world. She's living in like this pop alternative rock world, which, yeah, I think maybe even Weezer has been able to. I don't like what they've reinvented themselves into, but
Right.
they've maintained to have hit songs after Pinkerton and also continue to tour successfully and still make albums that people seem to like.
Yeah.
I don't like them, but other people do.
Yep. Well, our community was with us to a certain degree. 67% were the album, 5% better EP, and 29% decent single, which honestly, that kind of makes sense to me. Like I would imagine that some people, simply because of her voice and the way that she expresses herself, it's just a turn off. It's not in their wheelhouse. Even the lyrical content aside, just her voice alone could be divisive. A lot of artists are like that. I mean, there are people who don't like, you mentioned AC/DC. Brian Johnson does not have the most palpable or palatable voice for some people who just listen to it and go, that's screeching. And like, yeah, it is kind of, but it works, I guess, sort of. And when it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So thanks to everyone who voted, and thanks to everybody who commented on this episode. If you are listening to this and you would like to comment not only on one of our Diamond episodes, but any one of our episodes, you can go to digmeoutpodcast.com, or excuse me, you go to dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com to join the union at Patreon, vote in these polls, leave comments for these polls, join our Discord where we have conversations about not only these polls, but these artists and other things that happen this week. There was a lot of AI talk. We're discussing the future of our Skynet future, and also what Vadim is up to on his tours as a touring musician, and lots of interesting stages.
I love it.
It's very cool to get
to see the behind the scenes pictures and
yes,
the little details that, like, I don't know, as being a music nerd, that just make it fun.
And that happens all the time, all sorts of different topics. There was a whole beer discussion this week, and we do talk about music as well. And that's dmounion.com. You can suggest records for our monthly album tournaments by going to digmeoutpodcast.com and suggesting an album. I just did so. Anybody can do it. There's no law against me doing it, Jay.
You put some weird albums in there. I almost thought you were pulling
You know
our
what
leg.
I did? I went to the I Hate the 90s blog, run by one of our old friends, Shell, who is still active, still putting up stuff. And I was just like, let's look around. What's some stuff over on the I Hate the 90s and that I haven't heard. And I just sampled some things and was like, oh, okay, let's do that. I think maybe two of them were ones I had heard before, and which was Salt and Hooverphonic, I think was the other one. And Salt, I only know one song off that record. So you can do that, digmeoutpodcast.com. You can also sign up for the Box newsletter, which is our Substack newsletter. New releases every week of new music, movies, books, TV shows relevant to 80s, 90s, and aughts, musicians, bands, artists, etc. And that's also where our 80s metal podcast lives. We have just released a new episode. I think it was our 11th episode on Danzig, the self-titled album by Danzig. And we've got a whole bunch more coming. Lastly, Apple Podcasts is where you go to leave positive feedback for the show. So for Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.
For all that you